Look, I'm pretty sure all of you know Commissioner Ana Gomez by reputation and have a pretty good sense of her professional background. Simply put, she is a career professional in telecom law and policy, having worked extensively both in government and the private sector. What you may not know is that Anna is one of the few people, and perhaps the only person, who has hit the trifecta of holding senior appointed positions at each of the 3 key government agencies in the telecom sector. She served as the Deputy Administrator of NTIA at the Department of Commerce, the head of the work process at the Department of State, and of course as a commissioner at the FCC. And before that, just so as you know, she had lots of other really important senior positions at the commission. If there is someone who better understands telecom policy and how it's made, I do not know who that would be. So Commissioner, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So look, I'm old enough to remember when you thought running the World Radio Conference process at State was a tough job. Does that job now seem like it was a walk in the park?
Oh no, that job is very challenging. But obviously, being a commissioner also comes with its challenges, and we're dealing with them every day.
Okay, so look, before we talk about policy issues, I'd like to ask how your approach to the job has changed, or whether it has changed, now that there is a Republican majority at the commission.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you go from being in the majority to being in the minority as a commissioner, your job does change. In this regard, for me, it has changed so significantly because I have felt the need to speak out against this administration's violations of the First Amendment. And as you know, I have been quite vocal about my concerns. So much so, in fact, that I embarked on a First Amendment tour to raise awareness about this administration's violations of the law and the First Amendment. And you see it every day. It's obviously at the FCC, we've seen the weaponization of the FCC to go after broadcasters, to go after public broadcasters, and to retaliate against any coverage that this administration doesn't like, and to chill the speech, to chill the press in order to force these broadcasters and companies to report on the administration in a way that it wants. And we've seen it in other ways throughout the administration. On the very first action that the FCC took, which tells you what the priority of the FCC is, the very first action that the FCC took was against diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, both within the commission and outside of the commission. And then it embarked on investigations against broadcasters. It revived invalid complaints against the broadcasters in order to gain leverage over them that would lead to CBS settling its case against it for the 60 Minutes interview segments that it claimed were violating the FCC's rules. And then also complaints against NBC and against ABC that were not valid complaints at all. They had been dismissed by the expert staff before. And it's a harassment campaign in order to bring these companies to heel. And sadly, we've seen what I call corporate cowardly capitulation, where in pursuit of their own financial interests, they are in fact now suppressing the content in order to gain the approval of this administration. And I fear that we're going to continue to see this. But I call this an administration-wide campaign to censor and control because it's not just at the FCC. We see it at the Federal Trade Commission in opening investigations against partisan groups and against their speech, in forcing ad companies to stop moderating where they submit ads because of the content that may also be harmful to the brands of their companies. We've seen it in retaliating against law firms in order to punish them for who they represent and what they represent, and then force them to represent causes that this administration likes. We've seen it in the censoring of museums and the investigations and threats against universities to change their curricula, all in the name of combating anti-Semitism. We've seen it in administration-wide campaigns against diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've seen it in the firings of Democratic commissioners throughout the agencies. We've seen it in dismantling independent agencies. It's all in pursuit of censorship and control. And so I embarked on this First Amendment tour because I think it is that important that we make people aware, because we can't let this become the new normal.
So, I don't want to step on your applause. So what kind of reaction have you gotten on this tour?
I've gotten very good reaction. In fact, I have never seen so much support for anything I've done as a public servant in my career. And as you know, I'm a long-time federal employee, so to speak. Interestingly, the support that I get is across the ideological spectrum, from conservatives to liberals. I know how old I am because I say liberal. And I like to say I get really great support from across the ideological spectrum. Where I hear criticism, it's usually in swear words.
Okay. So look, do you think your tour and the reactions you're getting are going to have any impact on the actions of the commission? And if not, what is it you hope you will accomplish through all of this? Because you are spending, as you pointed out, a lot of time and effort on it.
You know, I hope so. I hope it makes people think twice before they take actions, in the way that I've seen the weaponization of the FCC, in the way I've seen the weaponization throughout the administration. But we know I'm a minority commissioner. I only have so much power. So my power is in being able to use my position as a way to make people aware and to encourage others to have courage. We have seen examples of courage, and courage breeds courage. Capitulation, on the other hand, breeds capitulation, and it is so dangerous, particularly when we're talking about something as foundational as the freedom to speak, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, all the rights that we have under the First Amendment that this administration is trampling all over.
Okay, so this may seem sort of like a come down, but let's turn to more traditional FCC issues, the ones that are certainly, I'd say, First Amendment adjacent. What do you think about proposals to relax the media ownership rules? And given how the media landscape has changed, does it matter the way it once did? And should we even care?
Well, I still think that broadcasters very much matter. And I am very supportive, particularly of local broadcasters and the journalism that they continue to practice today. And so I think it's really important that we continue to uphold the pillars of our media policies, which are competition, diversity of viewpoints, and why am I forgetting the third? Localism. Good grief, I just said local broadcasters are so important. Sorry. And I still think it's really important that we continue to support those pillars. Now, I am very much aware that the business has changed significantly. And I go and I meet all over the country with broadcasters to try to understand their practices, their businesses, to try to understand what it is that the commission can do to ensure that we continue to promote localism, diversity of viewpoints, and competition. I think it's really important that we keep in mind that not every market is the same. And so whatever it is that we do, I hope that whatever proposal the chairman puts before us, that it keeps that in mind, because it's important that we continue to promote this. And if we don't, then what I worry is we are going to get nationalized, basically whitewashed journalism that is not going to be serving their local communities. And we need local communities to have that service. And local broadcasters are passionate about serving their communities, but I understand that the business is different and that competition is different and that we need to maybe think about ways to allow them to continue to evolve and to succeed in this landscape.
So let's turn to an area where the Commission is perhaps playing a bigger role than it did historically, national security. Like former Commissioner Symington, you've been a big proponent of the Cyber Trustmark program. Can you briefly describe what it is for those not in the know and where you think the Commission is going with it and what comes next, if anything?
Yeah, the Cyber Trustmark program is a really good example of a public-private partnership. It's also a really great example of a market-driven mechanism that is voluntary and self-regulatory. These all sound like such great Republican principles in our normal governance. But what it is supposed to do is it is a system by which companies apply for and show that they are meeting good cyber hygiene standards and that their products meet those standards. And then you'll get a mark and you'll get a little QR code that you can then get more information about that particular product. And the idea is to let that be a driver in the market for consumers to see and hopefully adopt, and then it breeds more good cyber hygiene practices. Right now, it's on pause. And it's on pause at the Commission because there are concerns that United Laboratories has labs in China. And this has raised concerns about control over the system that will then lead somehow to less cyber secure products. I'm concerned about this. I think this is a great program, and I think that there are ways to mitigate something like that if there really are concerns about that. We don't have Chinese ownership. We have lots of examples of ways that companies can take mitigation measures to address this type of concern, including localization of data and other ways to ensure that we don't have harmful Chinese influence in our system to label our products as cyber secure, or at least meeting cyber secure standards. So I'm hopeful that the Commission will stop this halt and that we can get this started over again so that we can move forward with what I consider to be a really good market-driven product.
So with apologies to our non-telecom friends here today, I'd like to get a little wonkier. Most of those interested in the USF breathed a sigh of relief after the Supreme Court decision rejecting the argument that the current framework is unconstitutional. But there is still a consensus, I think, that the Universal Service Fund is, I don't know, broken. The USF Working Group on the Hill has opened a portal asking for comments from anyone and everyone about how best to reform the USF. Were you to file comments, what might you say?
So I do think it's really important, obviously, that we reform the Universal Service Fund to be sustainable, particularly in today's environment. The last time we looked at the Universal Service Fund was after the 1996 Act, and a lot has changed since that time in the market, and it's leading to the pressure that we are seeing to reform the system. I do think it's important that Congress act. Congress needs to act so that we can make it a long-term sustainable program that leads to affordability of communication services for consumers.
So I obviously need to ask a couple of questions about spectrum, space, and the next World Radio Conference. So let's go in reverse order. The next WARC is going to be held in China in 2027. And while that seems far away in both time and place, you know better than most that it's going to be upon us really quickly. So what advice do you have for the government agencies and the private sector to ensure a successful outcome for U.S. interests? And what can the FCC do, perhaps better than it has before, to aid in achieving such a successful outcome?
Everybody who does World Radio Communication Conference work knows that this is a never-ending effort You end one conference and immediately you start into preparing for the next one. And it's a domestic process to get to U.S. positions as early as possible, and an international process to gain the support of countries throughout the world so that we can succeed in the consensus process that is the WRC. So what does that mean? Already we have the working groups working on the federal side and on the non-federal side to come to recommendations as early as possible. And it's really important that we move as fast as possible with that process so that we can get to our final US positions and start selling them in the international process as soon as we can. That means getting to consensus positions and then coordinating them between the two sides so that we can get to a final US position. That is a very difficult process. Now, this time around, we have a lot of satellites on the agenda. Almost too many if you're the staff that are trying to work them, but they're very exciting. And it tells you how important the satellite sector is, both to the US and internationally. So we need to make sure that the US is in a position to have its positions so that it can start selling them throughout the rest of the world. What does that mean? It means we need to use our soft power too. We are going to see the consequences in WRC 27 of this administration's actions, eliminating most of USAID, eliminating our international support. And it's going to drive the parties with which we normally work in order to have this consensus that we need to succeed into the arms of China, who, believe me, is leaping into our leadership position. And that is really problematic. And of course, as you said, the next WRC is slated maybe to be in China. It appears like that's where it's headed. And that's going to give them a lot of advantage as well in how they run the agenda and in how they ingratiate themselves with our international partners. So we really need to make sure we are prepared as soon as possible and that we have a head of delegation appointed as early as possible so that they can begin the important work of working with our international partners.
So picking up on your notion of the note about satellites and the new Space Bureau, some of us working on these issues have thought for years that the satellite licensing process was too lengthy, even arcane, and that the processing round process for LEOs had simply become an impediment to growth. Agree? Disagree? And if you agree, any thoughts on improving the process?
Well, you are the chief of the Bureau.
It was 30 years ago, in fairness. That wasn't nice.
Sorry, I couldn't help it.
I know you couldn't.
So, the FCC's work on satellites has been decades in the making. And the way that we used to license satellites was bespoke. Each system would come in, they were all different, and the FCC staff, who are some of the most customer-driven staff, I think, at the Commission, would work with each of the applicants to work through whatever issues that they felt that a particular application raised. Well, that was something back when you only had a couple satellites worldwide, and things weren't as prolific as they are today. Now with LEO and MEO and all these large constellations and lots of satellites, we're seeing a lot more demand on the the Space Bureau's resources that we had not seen before. And it is time, obviously, for us to look at and to streamline, which we just took action this month, last month? It's August. This month, thank you, to look at more ways in which we can streamline our processes. I absolutely think it was a brilliant move on Chairwoman Rosenworcel's part to create the Space Bureau. It reminds me of when the FCC created the Wireless Bureau, right at the cusp of when wireless really became such a dominant part of our communications. And the Commission has been working since then to look at all of its processes, to try to be responsive to companies, and to help those that may not be as familiar with the FCC's licensing processes through, for example, the Transparency Initiative. So yes, we need to continue working to streamline and to allow these systems to continue to provide their services while at the same time protecting the public interest and our good stewardship of space internationally.
So returning to Earth, the Commission has finally gotten its auction authority renewed. And that, by the way, should get a round of applause. I'm just saying, for those of you who do telecom. And it has a mandate now, a congressional mandate, to auction 200 megahertz of spectrum within 2 years. I think another 300 megahertz of spectrum in 3 years. And I got to say, that's a lot of spectrum. The Commission is already focused on upper C-band. Finding the rest is not going to be easy. Studies of the 7 gigahertz band begun under the last administration are ongoing. But then what? There have been lots of talks about re-auctioning CBRS spectrum under rules that would allow high power use. You have any thoughts on that, or where other spectrum might be found to comply with the congressional mandate? Because I sure don't.
Wasn't that your job at the last administration?
You know, I'm not ever doing one of these with you again. I'm just saying.
I don't envy this administration in its direction to find 800 megahertz of spectrum. It's not an easy task. And it's not an easy task because there's so little greenfield spectrum left. Obviously, if we could snap a finger and come up with mid-band spectrum for industry, that would be fantastic. And if we could run an auction, that would then hopefully be authorized to use the funds to fund Next Generation 911, to fund affordability programs for people who need the support to be able to subscribe to broadband. It would be fantastic. But it's not easy. And there's a reason why it's not easy. I am very hopeful that even with the language of the reauthorization of the act that reauthorized our auction authority, that the studies that were being conducted at DoD of the 3 gigahertz band and the 7 gigahertz band won't stop, because we need to continually do this. This is a constant need, both at the FCC of our own licensees as well as at the federal level, to make sure that we have turned every stone we can turn over to find new ways to use spectrum more efficiently, and to be able to get the carriers the spectrum that they need, particularly for 6G, while still continuing to provide the unlicensed spectrum that has led to so much innovation. With regard to CBRS, one of the things that we've been talking about for years is that we do need to find ways to share spectrum. Greenfield spectrum for exclusive use is just very difficult to find. And so what we've seen is new and innovative ways to utilize spectrum. And CBRS was a really good example of spectrum that is being shared by multitudes of users. And one of the things that we saw that I certainly wasn't expecting is these scrappy companies coming in and turning into competitors to the very large companies to provide broadband services, to provide fixed wireless services. And we've seen both on the GAA side and the PAL side, and I'm sorry to use acronyms, I can't remember what they stand for, be able to utilize that spectrum to provide broadband services in areas that aren't necessarily reachable for whatever reason, whether it's cost or whether it's demand. And so I think it would be a crying shame if what we did was pull the rug out under these companies that have spent billions of dollars to deploy new and innovative services. So I think we need to keep looking before we go right to, well, let's just take their spectrum.
So I want to open it up to questions. I'd like to ask one more before we do. Referred to the anomaly of you being a Democrat on independent commission. The whole concept, of course, of independent agencies is under attack. Now, you worked at NTIA, right? I know you loved working at NTIA. How bad would it really be if the FCC were combined into NTIA and you had an agency that just did telecom rather than an independent agency? Is anything lost in your view?
So when Congress created the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Radio Commission before it, Congress did so very thoughtfully. It considered whether to simply put the FCC, well, then it was the Federal Radio Commission, under Commerce. But it decided that it would be too dangerous to have one person control the most important communications medium at the time, which was radio. I still think that's true today. Congress rejected having the FCC be part of the executive branch because it thought it was too important not to have that under one party. That's why you have a multi-member commission. And that is why it continues to be a multi-member commission. We have seen what happens when this administration weaponizes its authority. We have seen what happens when the Department of Justice is not independent. We have seen what happens when the FCC acts at the behest of this administration. What you lose is too important. So no, I think obviously there are parts of the FCC that could be done elsewhere, but when it comes to the fundamental communications media, and that includes not just broadcasters and not just radio, but also when you are talking about things like broadband, the provision of broadband services, the provision of streaming services, which we don't regulate, don't worry, and thoughts about regulating social media and content platforms, whether there's authority or not, which I argue there isn't. I think it's too important that we remain an independent agency.
Thank you. Okay, do we have some questions for Commissioner Gomez?
My toes are burning.
I see one in the back.
Commissioner Gomez, Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. Thank you so much for continuing to speak out. Everyone, I'm sure, appreciates here what you've been doing to defend the First Amendment and to talk about the institutional structure of the agency and the link between that and the potential for abuse. I'm curious, after Watergate, there was a moment where we had the Church Commission to reassess surveillance. We had the Tunney Act to guard against the weaponization of the antitrust laws. Do you have any thoughts about how to get us to that moment, if we have the chance to implement legislative reforms to deal with these kinds of abuses? How do we get to that moment where we can write laws that frankly prove more effective than the Tunney Act has been? And do you have any particular suggestions about what those should be, not just for the FCC, but for the regulatory state in general?
Yeah, I do think that Congress can act to prevent what I consider to be abuses right now of our regulatory authority. One very important way that I think Congress could help us is by defining terms that are vague within the statute. What you are seeing is the Commission keeps talking about the public interest, that licensees are not acting in the public interest when they're doing things like reporting the news in a way that the administration doesn't like. And I think it behooves us as a commission to initiate a rulemaking to define what we mean by the public interest. If it is not just localism, competition, and viewpoint diversity when it comes to broadcasts, and anything else when it comes to other enterprises. I think that's one way to be very helpful to keep us from overreaching in order to get an outcome that we want, and frankly, to chill the free press.
Other questions? Come on, I know you guys normally would spend lots of time trying to get to talk to Anna. Here you have a free shot.
Wouldn't, I know it sounds radical, but wouldn't a simpler way to solve this problem would to take away the FCC's authority to approve or disapprove license transfers, and generally to limit its licensing authority in some way?
that's radical. But I don't know how that would serve the public interest if you're not
Well,
looking
You
at.
wouldn't be able to deny a license if you didn't like the way they covered the news.
That's true, but then what would happen when you try to transfer it?
Well, you'd have another property right. You'd define a different property right.
Okay, well, something to talk about, I guess.
All right, I know a lot of you, including...
There was one other
Was there
hand.
another question? Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi. On Friday, a federal appeals court affirmed the FCC's authority to hit T-Mobile with a $200 million fine over its sale of consumers' location data. That came from the last administration. I mean, do you see much appetite in this administration for those types of privacy regulatory efforts over wireless carriers?
I haven't seen anything thus far where this commission is enforcing in that particular case. This administration has argued to protect its ability to take enforcement action, which is why we keep seeing these victories in the appeals court. I don't think it matters that it's privacy related. I think it matters more whether we're able to continue to take these types of enforcement actions. I hope that we will continue to take privacy related actions.
Okay, last chance. Any other questions? Okay, can I have a round of applause for Commissioner Gomez?
Thank you.